All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for staying here before lunch. Really appreciate it. We're going to figure out how to get rich on investing in Asian infrastructure. And we're looking forward for a very exciting panel. I'm going to each panelist introduce themselves a little bit more, a little bit what they do. But we'll start with Carlos and Andy, then Craig. Carlos, why don't you talk about what you do in your organization a little bit more?
My name is Carlos Katsuya. I'm IFC's Chief Investment Officer, and I lead our investments in the telecom sector in Asia, Europe, Middle East, North of Africa. IFC is part of the World Bank. We are the arm of the World Bank that deals with private sector in emerging markets.
I'm Andy Power. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Digital Realty. Digital Realty, we focus on data center co-location and interconnection solutions on a global platform with about 200 data centers across, most recently adding our 5th continent and 13th country with our entry into South America.
Craig Scroggie, I'm the CEO of NextDC. We're an Australian-based co-location provider. We currently have 8 operational data centers in all the major cities in Australia, with 3 new ones under development. So we're about $2 billion enterprise value and listed on the Australian Stock Exchange.
Great. Maybe we just start. How do you think Asia differs from the rest of the world? Where are we in terms of cloud adoption or new applications and the infrastructure required? Maybe we'll start with you, Andy, because you have a really big global view.
Sure. So I look at in our industry, kind of the maturity curve kind of starts in the U.S. and works its way east, with the U.S. being the most mature, followed by Europe, and Asia being the least mature, which means the most growth, most new customers landing there. You see that from a competitive standpoint. There's really no pan-Asian competitor today. There's only really Digital Realty, one other global competitor offering Asia and Australia in a global footprint. So it continues to be a very high growth market, new customers landing there, new customers expanding there, and an area we're looking to invest further in.
And Craig, how do you think Asia is growing versus the rest of the world? Obviously, you're looking at Asia in quite a bit of detail yourself.
Yeah, look, the Australian market has certainly been very fortunate. Enterprises in Australia have been early adopters. So you've seen quite aggressive uptake of the majority of the public cloud platforms. And certainly the popularity of Microsoft for Office 365 and Amazon as a service, and even a number of the other emerging providers, particularly more recently the entrance from China. The amount of growth really reflects the Australian compute infrastructure, maybe even almost skipping a generation, going straight from the on-premise management of infrastructure and directly into the public cloud. So you've seen fairly material size investments from the Microsofts and Amazons of the world into Australia, and they're certainly in their 2nd or 3rd generation of infrastructure investments. So no question that Australia certainly has behaved like an early adopter of public and private cloud technology.
And Carlos, you focus more obviously on emerging markets in Asia. What are the fastest growing countries that you see right now, and where's the most infrastructure kind of required over the next few years in those developing markets?
Okay, so I think Asia, one of the interesting things about Asia is that you can find countries in pretty much every stage of development, right? Even among the developing markets. So at one end, you have markets like India and China, where there is already a kind of a culture of infrastructure sharing. There is when it comes to even reliability of connectivity and power, that is some at a kind of a that is more it's more reliable, and and then you go through countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, all the way to other countries like let's say Myanmar or even Bangladesh. So you can find countries at different stages of development across the region.
And are you seeing a lot more capital being deployed in these countries for communications and compute infrastructure?
There is, and there is a general perception that there is a lot of capital available in Asia, and that is true, but it's still mostly for developed markets. When it comes to developing Asia, there is, in places like India and China, yes, there are quite a few, there is appetite for investment, but in some of the other markets, what we have seen is that there are especially firms backed by PEs, and that are realizing that have recognized the opportunities that those market represents, and they are taking advantage of the first movers. So that has allowed to some of those firms not only to establish themselves secure, let's say, prime locations and even reach out to some of the key clients, right? But they have been able to, in some cases, we are starting to see even some of them to become targets for acquisition from some of the international players that want to enter some of those markets.
Before we get to that M&A question, which I definitely want to ask, Andy, could you talk about maybe just some of the challenges in investing in Asia and what you look for in different markets that you enter in Asia, and how does that compare to what you do in the US and Europe?
Sure. So Digital, our Asia Pacific portfolio is headquartered in Singapore, but really stretches from Sydney up to Tokyo. And obviously a misnomer of Asia is thinking of it as a homogenous unit, because the culture and the way of doing business in Japan is a lot different than Hong Kong, Singapore, or Australia. Each has different nuances, more nationalistic or non-nationalistic tones, government involvements. By and large, everything is a little bit more challenging than experience we've had in the US. Procuring land, fiber, availability and cost of power, supply chains, which I think that allows us to add a lot more value for our customers, where they've had less experience in some of these countries, even on the developed countries, where we can bring to bear our value, as can Craig in Australia, and really differentiate our offering to those customers.
But obviously you're operating some very, very high cost locations. Can you get higher prices to offset that higher cost?
I mean, if you look at one of our typical buildings in Europe or North America, we never typically build north of 2 stories. And if you go to Singapore, our buildings are 8 stories. The land is much more constrained. And obviously, we're a data center investment REIT, so we have to offset that cost of capital that we're deploying in terms of the rates that we provide to our customers.
Craig, you've been in the networking world a long time and an innovator in data centers and cloud. Can you talk about, are you doing anything different that you think technologically than maybe other data center companies doing around the world, or are you building 8-story data centers? I haven't seen one yet, but.
All right. Yeah, look, I think just building on Andy's comments, we recently acquired a third site in Sydney in a place called Gore Hill, which is a few kilometres out of the CBD. We paid just under $100 million for that. So certainly, as the company has continued to develop and evolve, our focus has been very, very network-centric, staying close to core cities, leveraging a multiplicity of networks in order to drive our partner-first go-to-market model. So we tend to look at the opportunity in hyperscale, see some value there, but be very, very focused on a retail-centric co-location model. The development of those ecosystems are critically important because certainly if you look at the size and scale of Andy's business, his weighted average cost of capital is going to be probably the lowest or one of the lowest in the world in the data center businesses. So we have to have a bifurcated model that allows us to get outlier economic performance, but do it inside of our business model rather than our cost of capital. Using the example about the site that we just acquired, ultimately those multi-story developments, we've started to work towards perfecting a couple of things, and that is building a hybrid business model that allows us to have the benefit of the cloud, but also the economic performance of retail co-location. Doing that in very expensive locations close to the CBD means that we have to obviously focus on getting a balance in our returns, but certainly we are building 8-story plus data centers now. When we look at all of the markets where you have a smaller amount of available land and have very, very high land prices on a relative basis, we have to build more multi-story developments. So we're building tier 4 data centers now. We're doing them very network-centric, but they are, the second data center is 8 stories. The third one will be more than 15 stories. So we're starting to work on a model that allows us
So how do you technically handle the backup power and the cooling with such a high building? Are the generators going on the roof? Are you using other forms of backup power that we don't know about, or other cooling technologies?
Yeah, look, the data center design in itself still requires redundancy, so for power and cooling and all those things, the model is still largely the same. However, we have to be more innovative when it comes to jamming all of that infrastructure into a very, very small space. The thing that is critically important as you start to look at markets, particularly considering areas like Singapore that are far more humid, cooling technology becomes critically important. The amount of water, the recycling, the sustainability efforts that you make and invest in the company become critically important, both for the customer and for the governments that you're working with in any of those respective areas. So ultimately building data centers for extremely efficient operation, being able to reduce your PUE even in high temperature environments is going to be an important competitive advantage in the future because it allows you to deliver the lowest total operating cost for your customers.
So how quickly can you lease up these facilities as you build them?
Look, we've generally sort of targeted somewhere in the order of about a 3 to 5 year fill rate for the development of sites. But ultimately that becomes an outcome. You could fill a whole building very quickly with a few clients. But as I said earlier, our model has always been to focus on retail co-location as a differentiator and focus on the network services and cloud on-ramps that we provide.
Andy, Craig touched on this. Australia obviously seems to have adopted cloud very, very quickly. Are there different hyperscale providers that you see in Asia, maybe that you don't see as much in the United States? I know there's a lot of Chinese cloud providers that are going into Europe, but do they play a bigger presence as customers for you in Asia than maybe that you see in the United States right now?
I mean, going back to my maturity of the industry comment, you're starting to see more and more of the same names everywhere. The misnomer of this industry is that every single cloud service provider or SaaS provider or hyperscaler is on the same exact trajectory when that's not the case. They're opening different availability zones at different times. They're re-upping their commitments to different regions at different times. And on they're all growing. They're all growing at leaps and bounds, but different trajectories, which is great as an industry, quite honestly. So we're catching demand and supporting these customers and supporting them in all different parts of our global portfolio and Asia and Australia. But you're seeing a lot of the same names popping up more and more in these different countries.
Great. Carlson, maybe just switching to the emerging markets again in Asia. Are you seeing other bottlenecks than just data centers, or how is basically the communications last mile plant, wireless and wireline? Are we seeing much investment going into there, or are we also seeing shared infrastructure in those assets like we're seeing with data centers in terms of, are we sharing towers more, or are we sharing more fiber?
Again, I think that really depends on the market, and you can see markets in different stages of development, right? But if we look at developing Asia, I think there are some challenges that are common across the region, right? I think one of them that is, I wouldn't say that it's specific to Asia, but it's very much so, it is very prevalent here. It's, for instance, regulatory aspects, right? So when you look at developing Asia, there are issues like limitations to foreign ownership. There are issues about the role that state-owned companies, incumbents, play in some of those markets, and the access that they provide to any other player to their fiber, because they still own most of the fiber that is on the ground, right? And in some cases, you have those state-owned companies that, well, actually in some of the markets, you come to a situation where you talk to the Minister of Communications and the guy says, no, I want to liberalize access to the fiber that is in the ground. But the guy cannot do anything because then that is let's say, the Minister of State-owned Companies, right? That is saying, no, I'm never gonna do that because if I allow other companies to have access to the fiber that is owned by my company, that will potentially reduce the flow of dividends that I'm getting from them, right? So I think this is also something very common that we see in Asia. The role that the regulatory body plays, right? You will still see many places where the regulator is not fully independent. So that just makes things like rights of way, their ability to have access to the grid in some cases, it just makes all those issues even more complicated to overcome. Having said that, we cannot forget the fact that there are about, 3 billion people in emerging Asia, right? And those people are data hungry. The data traffic is booming there, right? If you look at places like Indonesia, it's the fastest growing market for Facebook, I believe, right? So it is a market that cannot be ignored. And there are increasing requirements for data to be held domestically, and governments are starting to enforce those legislations. So we are very confident that what we've seen happening in places like Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia over the last few years. It's just a matter of time to happen in emerging Asia, and it's going to happen much faster than we have seen in other places.
And
just touching on Carlos's comment, our industry is catering to some of the most sophisticated, savvy global companies and customers in the world. They see these long-term trends, and they're pushing their vendors to bring the operational standards to not only developing countries, but when we entered some of our mature countries like Japan, filling vacuums where that same level of service and consistency was not being delivered. And that's going to continue to outreach into many of the countries that Carlos just mentioned. They see the massive opportunity of users. They need to deliver that same user experience that they're delivering around the globe. So I think this is going to continue to grow in those other new countries.
And Carlos, are there any countries doing a really good job from a regulatory perspective that you would encourage people to look to invest capital now on infrastructure?
Well, I think it's all about a window of opportunity, right? And we are seeing already some players take advantage of that window of opportunity. I think, you know, I don't want to say that some of the international players are more conservative, but I think just because of their global footprint, they have the luxury of being able to, whenever they are allocating their capital, they can see, hey, am I going to put my extra dollar in Asia, or am I going to continue to invest in a safer and well-known market like the US or Europe, right? So they have the ability to choose where they are going to invest. On the other hand, you have some, let's say, emerging companies that are more focused in some of the peripheral markets, and they are moving in, right? So again, we are seeing especially companies backed by some of the PE firms that are moving already into places like Indonesia, India, right? And they are taking advantage, especially in the sense of securing prime locations, right? And having access to, let's say, to the blue chip names in those markets. Because let's not forget, until now, Indonesia is a market that has been to a large extent being served from Singapore, okay? One can argue that when it comes to connectivity from Singapore to Jakarta, right, or from Jakarta to other places across Indonesia is not much better than from Singapore to those places within Indonesia, right? But latency requirements, sovereign data requirements, all of that is just driving business into Indonesia. So whoever has been already there established has an advantage over the global players that are starting to move into that country.
Craig, are there any bottlenecks to cloud adoption that you're seeing in Australia and other parts of Asia? Do we have enough on the C-fiber bandwidth connectivity? Do we have enough fiber, you know, getting deployed and wireless infrastructure and spectrum getting deployed?
Yeah, look, I think as you look at the differences between each of the cloud providers, depending on what you are doing with the applications, it's going to be very, very use specific. So we see, I guess, probably a couple of key trends there. One being that if you're using office productivity tools and other things that are largely network light, you can predominantly access those through the internet. You're able to not see any impact to services, and frankly, you could be taking those from anywhere in the world. Contrast that with where you're taking application and network heavy services. It may be high I/O database related support, Oracle applications and others, and you'll want to see the network playing a big role in ensuring that traffic gets to and from the end user to the service and back again. The network is increasingly important, both its resiliency and ultimately the latency. As Carlos has just said, you know, the data privacy related issues continue to be a major focus for organisations. But the one that I think is probably the most interesting for us is going to be around, you know, you've got new cables coming in from Singapore to Perth and then around to Sydney. So we were recently supported with our second Perth data centre, the Indigo cable that's coming into Perth and going around to Sydney. So those additional cable investments are critically important, obviously, for the growth of cloud right across Asia.
Very, very good. So I'm going to get to questions for the audience, but before we get there, Andy, we've seen a lot of consolidation in the United States of data center companies. I mean, there's maybe a little bit more to go, and we have obviously Pan-American operations like yourself and a couple of your peers, and you guys have expanded, pretty well. You cover most of Europe, it seems at this point, but Asia still seems to be fairly fragmented. Do you think ultimately that will also consolidate down? Will you have one supplier that covers most of Asia? And what would be the benefits or distractions from doing something like that?
I mean, at Digital, we're long-term believers in offering a global platform for our customers and trying to be their solution provider, whether it's in Osaka, Japan, or Frankfurt, Germany, or Ashburn, Virginia. And we think that provides value to the customers, one responsible party, consistency from deployment operations, form of contract, and so on. I think that's the end game as this industry gets more global, as the world gets more international, as everything scales from an infrastructure standpoint. And I do think along the way, you'll probably see a Pan-Asian player rise up. But I think the longer-term trends for the industry and the growth around it speaks to more global players and those capabilities to help these customers.
Greg, do you see yourself going outside of Australia at some point?
As a publicly listed company, the answer to that question would be, I'll let you know when I can let you know. But obviously, we aspire to continue to grow the platform, taking the company now to sort of that north of 2 billion market cap. I have 11 facilities operating, a target capacity of about 300 megawatts. But the region continues to be the fastest growing region in the world. It has an extraordinary opportunity, obviously billions of people. They're all skipping a generation of network technology in the sense that they no longer require fiber infrastructure. Everyone's holding a handset and ultimately have access to 5G. A child in Mumbai today has access to the internet and the same information that the founders of Google had and have. So, I mean, you think that there are extraordinary emerging opportunities. I'd like to think that certainly we can grow our platform, but you're also seeing the counter to Andy's observation in terms of makes sense to have fewer suppliers, leverage a global platform, but at the same time you're seeing an extremely large inflow of capital coming into the industry and continuing to buy assets and look for consolidation opportunities. So there have been fewer of those. There's been a few done in Australia and there's been a small handful done in Asia. But I've probably, in all the time that we've been doing this, this would be the height of activity I've seen from a private investment point of view. So there's enormous inflows of capital coming to the data center industry.
And are you worried about, well, it sounds like this new building might be $1 billion type investment. Is that, so can you get the capital easily?
Yeah, as a public company, obviously, continuing to...
A lot of capital.
Yeah, of course. And our CapEx numbers continue to grow. It's about $500 million a year at the moment, but I don't anticipate, when you're growing at 30 or 40% compound every year, the rate of growth is important. It reflects the growth in technology in the industry, both in Asia and globally. But there is, an enormous pool of capital that wants to continue to invest in the long-term great return profile that data centers have and will continue to demonstrate.
Any questions from the audience? Anything? All right, good. Any final thoughts of how people can make money in Asia, or any predictions on? Greg?
I'll start with Carlos.
Okay, well, again, as I said, the opportunity is there, okay? Early movers have had an advantage, but at the same time, the capital in Asia, while abundant to some extent, also needs to be patient. And that I think is something that investors need to keep in perspective, especially when we're talking about emerging Asia. We are very keen to see this market develop. We believe the potential is there. It will happen, okay? And it will happen probably at a faster pace than we have seen in other markets. However, there are risks that need to be taken into account, and I think, they are possible. It's possible to manage to work around those issues.
I would say you want to align yourself with best-in-class providers like Craig's company or Digital Realty. And you can obviously invest in either of our companies in a stock as an individual or a fund. And at Digital, I know we've also had a fair bit of partnership in Asia. When we entered Japan, we initially went alone to Osaka and built our first data centers and acquired a campus. And then we contributed to a joint venture with Mitsubishi, which was a strategic partnership, really bolting onto a national conglomerate in that country. Us bringing our data center and co-location expertise, and Mitsubishi bringing a long, outstanding reputation in that region. And we've done that at other places around the globe. But the long and short of it, I think you want to partner with best-in-class providers.
Yeah, and I obviously support what Andy said. Please feel free to invest in our companies in a public market context. But also at the same time, we're not only equity funded, but we're debt funded. We've done the best part of about $500 million worth of bonds over the last few years. I know Andy just did debt issuance at a very, very low rate. So I think there's multiple ways and different risk profiles to be able to take advantage of the opportunities in the data center sector, and you should do that.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.